profound disquietude devoured him. He tried to fix his mind on the condition of agriculture and the Oxford movement. He wrote long memoranda in utterly undecipherable handwriting. He was convinced that he had lost all his money and could not possibly afford to be a Knight of the Garter. He had run through everything, and yet, if Peel went out, he might be sent for. Why not? He was never sent for. The Whigs ignored him in their consultations, and the leadership of the party passed to Lord John Russell. When Lord John became Prime Minister there was much politeness, but Lord Melbourne was not asked to join the Cabinet. He bore the blow with perfect amenity, but he understood at last that that was the end. For 2 years more he lingered, sinking slowly into unconsciousness and imbecility. Sometimes, propped up in his chair, he would be heard to murmur, with unexpected appositeness, the words of Samson: "So much I feel my general spirit droop, my hopes all flat. Nature within me seems in all her functions weary of herself. My race of glory run, and race of shame, and I shall shortly be with them that rest." A few days before his death, Victoria, learning that there was no hope of his recovery, turned her mind for a little towards that which had once been Lord M. "You will grieve to hear," she told King Leopold, "that our good, dear old friend Melbourne is dying. One cannot forget how good and kind and amiable he was, and it brings back so many recollections to my mind, though, God knows, I never wish that time back again." She was in little danger. The tide of circumstance was flowing now with irresistible fullness toward a very different consummation. The seriousness of Albert, the claims of her children, her own inmost inclinations, and the movement of the whole surrounding world, combined to urge her forward along the narrow way of public and domestic duty. Her family steadily increased. Within 18 months of the birth of the Prince of Wales, the Princess Alice appeared, and a year later the Prince Alfred, and then the Princess Helena, and 2 years afterwards the Princess Louise, and still there were signs that the pretty row of royal infants was not complete. The parents, more and more involved in family cares and family happiness, found the pomp of Windsor galling, and longed for some more intimate and remote retreat. On the advice of Peel they purchased the estate of Osborne in the Isle of Wight. Their skill and economy in financial matters had enabled them to lay aside a substantial sum of money, and they could afford out of their savings not merely to buy the property, but to build a new house for themselves and to furnish it at a cost of £200,000. At Osborne, by the seashore and among the woods, which Albert, with memories of Rosenau in his mind, had so carefully planted, the royal family spent every hour that could be snatched from Windsor and London, delightful hours of deep retirement and peaceful work. The public looked on with approval. A few aristocrats might sniff or titter, but with the nation at large the Queen was now once more extremely popular. The middle classes in particular were pleased. They liked a love match, they liked a household which combined the advantages of royalty and virtue, and in which they seemed to see reflected, as in some resplendent looking-glass, the ideal image of the very lives they led themselves. Their own existences, less exalted but oh so soothingly similar, acquired an added excellence, an added succulence from the early hours, the regularity, the plain tuckers, the round games, the roast beef and Yorkshire pudding of Osborne. It was indeed a model court. Not only were its central personages the patterns of propriety, but no breath of scandal, no shadow of indecorum might approach its utmost boundaries. For Victoria, with all the zeal of a convert, upheld now the standard of moral purity with an inflexibility surpassing, if that were possible, Albert's own. She blushed to think how she had once believed, how she had once actually told him, that one might be too strict and particular in such matters, and that one ought to be indulgent toward other people's dreadful sins. But she was no longer Lord M.'s pupil; she was Albert's wife. She was more: the embodiment, the living apex of a new era in the generations of mankind. The last vestige of the 18th century had disappeared. Cynicism and subtlety were shrivelled into powder, and duty, industry, morality, and domesticity triumphed over them. Even the very chairs and tables had assumed, with a singular responsiveness, the forms of prim solidity. The Victorian age was in full swing. 7. Only one thing more was needed. Material expression must be given to the new ideals and the new forces, so that they might stand revealed in visible glory before the eyes of an astonished world. It was for Albert to supply this want. He mused and was inspired. The Great Exhibition came into his head. Without consulting anyone, he thought out the details of his conception with the minutest care. There had been exhibitions before in the world, but this should surpass them all. It should contain specimens of what every country could produce, in raw materials, in machinery and mechanical inventions, in manufactures, and in the applied and plastic arts. It should not be merely useful and ornamental; it should teach a high moral lesson. It should be an international monument to those supreme blessings of civilization: peace, progress, and prosperity. For some time past the Prince had been devoting much of his attention to the problems of commerce and industry. He had a taste for machinery of every kind, and his sharp eye had more than once detected, with the precision of an expert, a missing cogwheel in some vast and complicated engine. A visit to Liverpool, where he opened the Albert Dock, impressed upon his mind the immensity of modern industrial forces, though in a letter to Victoria describing his experiences he was careful to retain his customary lightness of touch. "As I write," he playfully remarked, "you will be making your evening toilette, and not be ready in time for dinner. I must set about the same task, and not, let me hope, with the same result. The loyalty and enthusiasm of the inhabitants are great, but the heat is greater still. I am satisfied that if the population of Liverpool had been weighed this morning, and were to be weighed again now, they would be found many degrees lighter. The docks are wonderful, and the mass of shipping incredible." In art and science he had been deeply interested since boyhood. His reform of the household had put his talent for organisation beyond a doubt, and thus from every point of view the Prince was well qualified for his task. Having matured his plans, he summoned a small committee and laid an outline of his scheme before it. The committee approved, and the great undertaking was set on foot without delay. 2 years, however, passed before it was completed. For 2 years the Prince laboured with extraordinary and incessant energy. At first all went smoothly. The leading manufacturers warmly took up the idea. The colonies and the East India Company were sympathetic. The great foreign nations were eager to send in their contributions. The powerful support of Sir Robert Peel was obtained, and the use of a site in Hyde Park, selected by the Prince, was sanctioned by the Government. Out of 234 plans for the exhibition building, the Prince chose that of Joseph Paxton, famous as a designer of gigantic conservatories, and the work was on the point of being put in hand when a series of unexpected difficulties arose. Opposition to the whole scheme, which had long been smouldering in various quarters, suddenly burst forth. There was an outcry, headed by the Times, against the use of the park for the exhibition. For a moment it seemed as if the building would be relegated to a suburb, but after a fierce debate in the House, the supporters of the site in the park won the day. Then it appeared that the project lacked a sufficient financial backing, but this obstacle too was surmounted, and eventually £200,000 was subscribed as a guarantee fund. The enormous glass edifice rose higher and higher, covering acres and enclosing towering elm trees beneath its roof. and then the fury of its enemies reached a climax. The fashionable, the cautious, the protectionists, the pious,